Hello,
Hello.
everyone. Welcome to this edition of SWET Talk Shop. We have guest speaker Hannah Kirshner in conversation with Zackary Kaplan. And I'm going to turn the floor over to those two and let Zach take it from there with the proper introductions. So thanks for being with us today, Hannah. And thanks, Zach. Over to you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Okay, good morning or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Zach Kaplan, and I am based in Niigata, which I just saw someone in the comments wrote that they were in Niigata, which is exciting. But I am happy to have Hannah Kirshner here today, writer, artist, food stylist. Her book, Water, Wood, and Wild Things, which is subtitled Learning Craft and Cultivation in a Japanese Mountain Town, is going to be coming out in paperback March 29th, in just a few days.
Yeah,
Is that
right.
correct? And she's joining us from Brooklyn, New York today. And we're gonna kind of dive into what went into writing this book. I hope to hear a little bit about how she put it together and also what she's doing with her other journalistic aspirations. We'll start with a presentation in which we'll kind of see a little bit of what's in the book. But for those of you who have not yet read it, it's a really interesting collection of autobiographical stories with pen and ink illustrations and recipes. And it's just a very, very enjoyable look at material culture and the really wonderful experiences that Hannah has had in Yamanaka. And so I guess I will go ahead and turn everything over to Hannah to start with a brief presentation just on.
Sure. Yeah, I made a little slideshow to show you some pictures, and I figured for this particular group, it's a chance to get kind of geeky and like really talk about the process of research and writing the book. And then, the theme today is working across media. So, both within my career, if I can call it that, working as a food stylist, as a writer, doing video and audio and all sorts of things. And then in the book, the book itself includes drawings and recipes, and I use a lot of different media and tools in my research too. So let me share. Okay. All right. So that's the book. All right. So basically the research for the book, as Zach mentioned, it's about the material culture of Yamanaka Onsen, a hot spring town in Ishikawa Prefecture. And it's divided into 4 sections: water, wood, wild things, and cultivation, that all sort of weave together into the culture and community of this town. And so for the research, there were sort of 3 strands. There were experiences, actually doing and seeing things, and then more like conventional research, looking to books and documents for history and data and context, and then interviews. So the experiences is like first person journalism. I apprenticed to or followed people who are literally making the culture of the town. But the way this all started was with a 2-month apprenticeship at a sake bar in Yamanaka Onsen. And so for 2 months, I hung out behind the bar with Yusuke Shimoki, who owns this bar, and got a chance to like just really learn about sake by tasting every day. But the part that I maybe hadn't expected and that sort of opened up this whole world to me, which then became the book, was, a bar is like a community hub in a way. And so I met artisans and artists and farmers. I met somebody who was making his own charcoal. I met wood turners. Yamanaka Onsen is famous for its wood turning, for Yamanaka Shiki. And that was sort of where the idea for the book emerged from. And also just like this experience of apprenticing with Shimoki-san, and then sort of some of the other friendships and experiences that this led to, like, just I realized how, when you experience something firsthand and you really try to do it yourself, you get all these layers of information that you could never get from an interview or from just seeing it, like actually, doing it with your own hands or spending months and years with people where you're seeing how they interact with their colleagues and with their work. Okay, so I talked about working in the sake bar as sort of the beginning of this project. Well, it took a few years, but I eventually convinced the owner of a sake brewery to let me work in the sake brewery. And so for an entire season, I was part of the team, like just basically a regular kurabito or brewery worker. You see there on the picture where I'm leaning into the shubo and literally mixing it with my arms. And that chapter of the book is like very technical in some ways, but what I wanted to capture was just like the amazing like sights and sounds and just like the feeling of being in the brewery and also the exhaustion at the end of the day. Like the first week I worked there, every day I would come home at 5 and like just lie down on the floor in my apartment and not be able to get up. And
for everyone who doesn't know, sorry, the shubo is the yeast starter in the brewery.
So I actually liked this so much that when I finished the research for the book, I continued to work in the sake brewery. So I was there again last winter, working again for the 3rd year. So this is Takehito Nakajima, a really incredible wood turner who just makes these exquisite wooden cups and bowls. And he taught me how to make my own sake cups and my own bowls. So, the chapter I wrote is about him, it's about his work, but having him teach me, I really got a sense for like just how much skill it takes to do this, how and what all the steps in the process are. These are 2 different things here so we've covered water, wood, wild things. On the left side of the screen, that's sakamiryo, which is this kind of duck hunting that's only practiced in a very few places. As you see, they have these like Y-shaped nets that they toss up in the air as the duck is flying over. They have to time it exactly right so the duck doesn't see it. This net comes up, duck flies into it and falls to the ground and is stunned. And they only go for a few months of the year while the ducks are, it matches with the migration pattern when the ducks are at this pond, and they go only in the evening when the ducks are leaving the pond. And so for a season from November to February, I went out with them and, there's a whole permitting process. So I could not actually participate, but I went out with them and sat and watched. And so much of it's a really inefficient way to catch ducks. Like that's not really the point, but going out with them day after day, I began to understand the point in a way that like, I don't think that they might have articulated or told me, but you get to know how the patterns of the wind affect the ways that the ducks will fly. You see like the plants changing day to day, like what's dying and what's blooming. The sunset each day is different. And like, by the end of the season, I was just like, I want to do this. Like, I want to go out there every evening, like in the darkest part of the year, have this reason to go outside and just like be outside noticing. And then on the other side of the screen, I'm there with some mountain meijin who are teaching me how to forage for edible wild plants and herbs. And that was another part of the research for the wild things section of the book. And for cultivation, of course, I had to grow rice, among other things. And so I learned from a couple of people that were growing in a very traditional way, in some ways a very trendy way without any sort of chemicals, but also in a very old-fashioned way. So in some ways it's the same. So, I mean, most of you either live in Japan or have lived in Japan, so you, I'm sure, know very well that you should never leave a grain of rice in your bowl. But when you grow your own rice, you understand that in a whole different way. And planting the seedlings by hand, pulling the weeds, harvesting the bunches, drying it, threshing it all by hand. It really drove home like why each grain is truly so precious. And also in this like really metaphorical sense too, of just like, you know, the blue dragonflies in spring and the red dragonflies in fall, and like all the other sort of life and smells and sounds and activity that's like happening around the rice. Like that for me now is contained in those grains too. And cultivation, the last section of the book, I meant it not only literally, but also in terms of like cultivating community. Because as I said, what I wanted to do with this book was not only to, I mean, there's amazing artisans all over Japan, and I could have just written like a dozen profiles of amazing artisans, but I wanted to show how they were all connected in this local culture and community. And so this is the kaki no hazushi that we make for the festival every fall. Now it's sort of become our routine that I go with one of my neighbors and I help her make a couple hundred of these for the fall festival. And they're not sold at the festival, they're just given to friends and neighbors. And this is what everybody eats during the matsuri. So yeah, that's just like a very, very fast overview of some of the sections of the books and the kinds of experiences that were involved. So the experiences, this time that I spent with these people, and these experiences like form the narrative of the book. And that's what sort of makes it like not just a bunch of facts, but actually a story. But I felt like, well, I needed to include context too, history, and there was data that I wanted, but my Japanese is conversational. It's not fluent. It was probably worse than conversational when I started this project. Yet I was finding these things like these books about regional food or like a history of the villages around Yamanaka, and it would be such a shame not to be able to draw on those resources. So I was like, okay, well, here I'm hitting the limits of my abilities and I need to get help. So I ended up deciding to hire a research assistant. You know, I don't have a faculty position where like that's included. So I was paying hourly. So I had to, and I did have the book under contract with a major publisher. So I had some funding, but not endless. So I bartered with friends, and then I ended up hiring a friend hourly. So Yu Mizukami was the friend researcher who I hired as my assistant, and he was like the perfect person because he had grown up in this area. He'd actually written his thesis about Yamanaka wood turning, and he had sort of like some job for like a tech company in Tokyo. So, you know, he wasn't fully using his anthropological skills. So he's like, okay, this is like a kind of fun project. But also the fact he was in Tokyo, he had access to, you know, libraries, university libraries and major libraries that I didn't in the little town of Yamanaka and Ishikawa. So we just like kind of figured out, we just kind of winged it. Like, oh, and he was apprehensive at first because he's like, well, my English isn't that good. It's like, we'll figure it out. So I would send him a list of questions. He would read books that I'd sent him. He'd go to the library and find things, and he'd sort of send me the summary. And then we'd go back and forth. I'd be like, well, this is really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? So that was sort of how that worked. And then finally, he and some other friends also helped me with interviews to both confirm what I thought I knew. You know, I'd had these experiences where I'd spent months or years with somebody, but wanted to make sure, like, I think you said this, but like, is that really what you meant? And then also to ask for things that were sort of beyond the limits of my language ability. So yeah, those were the three strands of the research, and it was all sort of overlapping. You know, these experiences, some of them were happening consecutively, some of them were happening at the same time. And then once the book was under contract, I had a little over a year to finish it. So I don't even know how that worked. So I thought I'd also talk about how did I do all that research? What were my tools, especially for the experiences? So pocket notebooks. I really am obsessed with these Muji passport notebooks. And so I would always have one in my pocket. Like, some people have said to me, like, oh, how did you remember so much detail? Like, I didn't, like, I wrote it down. So, but it would just be little things, like sometimes it would be about the weather or a certain sight or smell, or if somebody just said something amazing, just jotting it down. And then I had more notebooks at home, one in every single room of the house pretty much, to try and combat my own laziness. So I really had no excuse that, like, at some point each day I would just journal and take more detailed notes. And then my phone is a great tool. I took tons of pictures, and I found myself referring to those a lot later on, like, oh, was it sunny that day? I think it was sunny that day. Well, oh, I have a picture from the day we harvested the rice. Like, yes, it was sunny. Or, oh gosh, how do I describe so-and-so's house? Well, oh, I got pictures of it. And then also another great tool, just like a little handy audio recorder that I used for the interviews, and then created transcripts for those. So those are my trusty reporting tools. And I'm just about done here, and then we'll start the discussion. But the process of writing the book also involved multiple mediums, or writing / creating the book. Oh, and that's my my writing companion, Hato-chan, a lost racing pigeon that I rescued and who kept me company while I finished writing the book. But that is my drawing desk, and almost all the things on that book, or almost everything on that desk in that photo, ended up in the book. If you have the book, if you've read it, you may recognize the persimmons, the chrysanthemums, the azuki beans from some of the illustrations. Oh, even that one particular leaf is illustrated in the book. So I was doing these experiences. As I sort of wrapped up one, I would start writing that chapter while I was still, moving on to doing another experience. And then the drawing I was also doing simultaneously. The drawings are sort of meant to, like, add another layer of detail or information that might be sort of cumbersome to put in the text, but then I can instead share through a drawing. And so sometimes in the evenings, when I was too tired to write, I could still manage to draw. And then cooking was also part of the process. Actually, the recipe, so there's a recipe at the end of each chapter, and that's also like a sort of another way to add like an anecdote or another sort of layer of information. Those were actually the easiest part for me, because I have worked as like a recipe tester, recipe developer, and a chapter, a narrative, like, you can craft that so many different ways. Like, how do you even decide? But a recipe, there's sort of like a straightforward format process. It was like that was a little more that was the easy part for me. Everything else was the hard part. And the recipes came from sometimes things that I was cooking in my kitchen, but mostly from things that people in the community taught me. So yeah, that's my talk.
Great. I've got tons of questions that I want to ask about this. It's interesting to hear you say that the recipes were kind of the easy part of it, which I guess maybe that would be the case. One of the things that I really liked about this book, and you touched on it, but you start with these profiles of these artisans, and you kind of have your autobiographical, your responses to what you're seeing, which I think is really easy to engage with as a reader. And then on top of that, you kind of go and then you zoom out some and you see the greater historical context, and you reference a lot of works, you reference a lot of history. You can kind of get the idea of, how has culture changed and where is it maybe going? What are our values as people, as readers, both? And then at the end of each chapter, there's something that the reader can actually enjoy as if they had been there and experienced the thing that that you've talked about, because each one kind of takes something from that experience that you've gone and lived. And I thought it was a really interesting format. And so kind of, I guess before going into that though, one of the big things that I want to know is, this was a multi-year process.
Yeah.
And you did this repeatedly and you met different people. And, I'm really curious because even with, pinning down a book deal with for a large publisher, like at what point did you decide that you wanted to make these experiences a book? And at what point in the writing process did you actually start pitching it? And like, what was that process like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. I'm going to start with answering the first part of that. So as I mentioned, it sort of started with this experience apprenticing in the sake bar. At that point, I had in mind that I wanted to write a book, but I thought maybe it was going to be a more conventional cookbook. And I thought that working in the sake bar would be like a good chance to just, if you're going to write a cookbook, you need an angle, right? Or you need some sort of expertise, like what's it going to be? And so I just thought, I don't know, that's going to open doors. I'm not sure which ones, but it's going to open doors. And I ended up writing just like a standalone article about that experience for Roads and Kingdoms. But while I was there, I went and made a few things with Takehito Nakajima, that wood turner. I became good friends with Nika Horie, the paper maker and photographer who I write about in the book. And I met Noboru Nimaida-san, Nimaida-san makes charcoal. He's like the last resident of his little village out in the outskirts of Yamanaka, and he makes charcoal, which used to be the main thing that village did. And I was like, I don't just want to write about the food. I want to write about how everything gets to the table. Like, how are all these things made, and who are the people making them? So I came back and I kept learning from Nakashima-san. Like, we kept making bowls and cups together, and I started to meet more people. And so then, like, that must have continued for like a year or two, that I was going a couple times a year for 2 or 3 months. And then I was able to put together a book proposal. So now I don't remember exactly when I started like really making it a book proposal, but I had to have a couple of sample chapters. So the sample chapters were the working in the sake bar, and then the wood and whiskey chapter about Nakashima-san. Maybe I had 3 sample chapters. I had at least 2. It was those 2. And then, so I don't know how much you want to know about like the actual like details of like creating a book proposal and pitching a book proposal, but
I mean, you don't have to go into too much about, but just what was your process for especially approaching large publisher? Did you approach a lot of different places? Did you already kind of know where you wanted to?
So, there's then if you're going to sort of go the route of trying to work with a major publisher, then there's the question of like, do you get an agent or not? And I'd already been writing and working in media, so some people were like, oh, you don't need an agent, like, people. But then other people were, no, you want an agent. Like, yes, you have to give your agent a percentage, but your agent will get you so much of a better deal that like it'll absolutely be worth it. And that was totally true. It takes a lot of the stress out of it, but also like they're just able to approach publishers that might not pay attention to you if you didn't have an agent, and they're able to negotiate on your behalf. And also, like, I will never, ever, ever have to talk to my editor or my publisher about money. Like, my agent does that. So that, then it keeps the relationship more just about the writing. So I actually got really lucky that like right around the time that I was sort of getting serious about pitching a book, an agent reached out to me and was like, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I was like, yeah, actually, and at that point I had a couple different ideas and we talked them over, and this was the one that she was like, that sounds really interesting to me. And then I did go and talk to a couple of other agents because I just wanted to sort of see like what options might be. And like, you know, one of them was like, well, if you could change this and like if you like move there and then like write it as like your first person account of like moving to this town. I was like, no, I mean, I want to write it in the first person, but like I want it to be about these people in this town, not me. And she also advised me that I should, my husband's Japanese, and she advised me to take my husband's last name because that would be more persuasive, but I authentic. And I mean, the thing is, strategically, she may have been right, but that just felt like a really uncomfortable reason to take my husband's name. So, and also like I am who I am. Like I am a white woman from America going to Japan, and I felt that it was like important to like acknowledge that and the privileges and challenges that come with that too, like in the book also. Yeah, and I ended up working with the agent that had originally reached out to me, and yeah, we went back and forth on the proposal, so which includes like an overview of the book and stuff, you know, about me and my work and sample chapters and all, marketing ideas and all this stuff. And so we went back and forth several times until she felt like it was ready, and then she took it. And yeah, it went around to a lot of publishers, and it seemed at first like, you know, what if I get a book deal that's like barely any money, and it's like, please go to Japan for a year and do nothing but research and write, and like here's a couple $1,000s. And I was like, but how could I do that? I was really, really lucky that at the last minute, like we got two really good offers, and I was able to take that year and have it be my job to finish the book. So
okay, so it sounds like things just really came together at multiple stages of this, and then you were able to go and have a solid year.
Yeah, which stretched into a year and a half, and like even what sounds like a lot of money is not, you know, what's paying an assistant and living in two countries and doing nothing but working on the book. And then of course, like, you know, it was supposed to be a year. It ended up being 18 months, which actually is pretty good considering how late some people are on their deadlines. So yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that, you know, you involved the research assistant who was someone that you knew. At what point did you really decide that was a route to go? Had someone recommended it to you? Did you just kind of come to the realization yourself? What was?
I mean, I'm not sure. Like I said, you know, I had a few chapters done and some research for more chapters like in progress by the time the book was under contract. And then it was like in August of 2018, I like arrived back in Yamanaka and was like, okay, I live here now and I'm writing a book. And I think I realized pretty quickly that I wanted to do that, maybe even before I like officially started. But I wasn't really sure what that was going to look like. At first, I thought it was maybe just like hiring a student or something who I could like send some book pages to and be like, can you just do like a rough translation of this for me? But then, yeah, like and actually, I think I had talked to that friend being like, do you know anybody that would want to do that? And then in talking to him, I was like, wait a minute, I think you're the person that I want to work with. And he was like really overqualified in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it was just, I think he just thought it was a fun project. And I don't know, a lot of nonfiction writers have research assistants, but they don't always talk about it. So I think a lot of people have been surprised or think that somehow like makes the book less mine or something like that. But you know, I think it's pretty common to hire a research assistant, and to me it's important to like acknowledge that work and that contribution. So and it was fun too. It was like a little bit of collaboration in a process that's otherwise pretty darn solitary, like the actual writing of the book.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thing that you say that. I thought that was interesting when I first kind of heard you talking about the process of writing this. You had mentioned hiring a research assistant, and that was something that had never really occurred to me. And I had wondered how you felt about that in that process. I think I could see why a lot of people would wonder about that. What was like one of the things reading the book, I thought that you have so many really interesting kind of random facts and tidbits in there where it's almost like, wow, how did you even manage to find this? Like you'll have, I'm trying to think of with the chapter on the duck hunting, for example, even the record of someone getting in trouble for brandishing a basket at the pond instead of a nut. A net, not just like a gun. Like you can't even have baskets around it. And it just seemed like the most obscure fact. And I wondered, like, how did you incorporate this person into your process, or how did you even go about kind of finding these things?
Yeah, gosh, that was a good one. And I think that came from like maybe some materials that so the duck hunting happens at this nature preserve basically, and so they have some publications on like the history of the Saka Medio, this kind of duck hunting and like, local history of the area. And I think it came from one of those. But that was what was like part of what was so great about working with somebody who is a good researcher and like really kind of just has an eye for stuff on their own. Like I think he could understand the kinds of things that I would find really fascinating or that might be a good detail, even if it, So, but it was just kind of a very fluid process of like, I'd send him a list of questions. I'd send him a stack of books or documents for each chapter. And then he would also go out and find things. Like if what I had sent didn't have the information we needed, he'd like go find things. But sometimes it also just came from questions I had where I was like, this kind of statistic could really, or like this kind of data could really like help drive home this point. Like, I wonder if that exists. And then
right.
Yusan would go and see if it did exist. And sometimes it turned out, sometimes it was nothing. And it was like, okay, that doesn't work. And sometimes it was like, okay, this is going to do what I need it to. So.
Great. I'm just going to interject here. We've got some questions coming up in the chat, and I want to invite everyone that if you have questions, go ahead and type them in. I'm hoping that the second half of this will be much more of a discussion back and forth. So I think I'm going to keep all of the questions that come up in the chat for the later half of the discussion and just kind of keep forging forward. But please bring your questions out. And then, so that's interesting. That's another thing that it seems like really just came together, because I could see why, or so many ways where it could be challenging to work with someone or kind of get the details that you need. You mentioned that originally you wanted to write a cookbook, and then it kind of turned into this, how does everything get to the table? That kind of puts a different light on how the book reads for me because of how I thought about it. I think, in my work, I deal a lot with craft just in general. So I really approached the book and kind of engaged with many of the craft portions and then a lot of the nature portions, really, because I think kind of in my childhood, there was a lot of overlap with maybe some of your experiences and the experiences of the people in this town. I really grew up in Colorado and had times where I was living on a mountain where there was no chain stores or anything for like an hour and a half, and just kind of in the middle of nowhere doing all of these things. And I really engaged with those parts of the books. And then my dad is also a chef. And so there was always a lot of this food stuff at home. And so I just kind of engaged with the craft portion, and there was like food at the end and a really good time. But it's interesting then that, you kind of thought of it as first a cookbook, and then that kind of evolved. This is where I want to segue into some of your other activities, because I know that, I only found out about your writing last year, shortly after the book came out. But since then, I've had the pleasure of reading some of your other articles in New York Times, such as T Magazine. And then there's also podcasts and kind of this auto journalism that you've done. And I know that some of those other things that you've done overlap with this book. There will be in the podcast, there's audio from chapters of involved with the book or whatever. How did that kind of evolve as you were going? Because if you came to this first thinking, okay, well, it's going to be a cookbook, and then, well, I want to tell the whole story for how it gets to the table, there's kind of a leap there to go, well, actually, maybe I also should do some audio journalism on this and bring people along. Or what was the...
So it started with just doing the audiobook. So Penguin Random House, so the book's published by Viking, which is part of Penguin Random House, and Penguin Random House, like pretty much all their books, they do an audiobook. And they'll usually like pick a couple of actors and then give the author a chance to like say like, oh, I like these three actors, voice actors, I like this one. Sometimes if it's memoir, if it's nonfiction, the author reads it themselves. So my book definitely presented some challenges in that, like, whoever was going to read it was going to need to be able to pronounce Japanese words because there are a lot of them. And so that really narrowed down the choices for the voice actors, and the ones that they chose, the one we really liked wasn't available, and then the other ones just weren't quite right. And so I was like, well, can I read it? And so I ended up narrating the audiobook myself, which was meant sitting in my closet for all day, every day for a week with a director in LA online with me, coaching me through reading the book. And so then once I'd done that, like when we were thinking about how to promote the book, I was talking to a friend who's worked in radio and podcasting a lot about just like what sort of interview shows or what places review books. And he's like, well, you should just try pitching, like doing some audio journalism yourself, like do some things that are related to the book. And like, oh, I could do that. He's like, oh yeah, you'll be fine. You can do it. I was like, okay. So I pitched something to the Proof podcast from America's Test Kitchen about Sakura, the boar hunter in the book, and sort of, so related to the book, but a little bit different, sort of focusing more on like the history of meat eating and game as part of Japanese food. And I did that. And so as an audio journalist, you're not necessarily doing any of the technical stuff yourself, at least not the editing side of things. So, especially a big place like that where they've got a whole team. So my job was to do the reporting, to write the script, to narrate along with the host. Yeah, the only technical part I had to do was like field recording and interviews and stuff, which I could manage. Audio editing, I still don't know how to do. And then it was like, once I had one under my belt, I was like, oh, well, I can add this to my repertoire of things I can do. And it tends to be I'm sure if you break it down by the hour, it doesn't pay any better and probably worse than writing articles, but it's a bigger chunk of work. And it's nice to be able to sort of like go into something in depth and work on one thing for a while. So
yeah, I was wondering about that, because it seems like putting together or doing a podcast, even if you're not having to do the editing, but just writing the script, working with the people on it, actually recording it, it seems like such a huge project.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, the editor that I worked with on that first one, she really likes helping print journalists transition to audio. And so she just sort of like walked me through each step of the process. And definitely it's a different kind of writing, because the words that are nice to read on a page are not necessarily how you talk. And so you have to actually think about how you talk as you write, and like write the way that you talk. So, and structurally, it's a little different too. Like, I think a lot of the time when if you're reading something, you can go back and be like, read a name and be like, oh, who was that? Oh, I'll go back to the page before. Oh yeah, that was that guy. But like, nobody's going to rewind a podcast to like remember who somebody was. So, and so I'm still sort of learning, like, you know, with writing, you usually want to kind of like show, not tell, but like with audio, at least the sort of style of podcasting that's popular in America right now, you kind of need to be like, here's what I'm going to tell you. Okay, now I'm showing you.
Right.
So it has been, I'm still learning how to like kind of write in a different way for it, but it's fun. I really like it.
Yeah. No, it's been really enjoyable to listen to. I'm like sitting here looking at the clock because I'm like, there's all this stuff that I want to ask, and yet, but so that difference of how you write, how you do it, I think that's really interesting. It kind of, you know, you've come in a way farther and farther away from this initial point of like cookbook, but it's definitely spreading out into, okay, well, what's the food that we eat? How does it get here? What's the greater story of it? Where do you see kind of your career going as far as like with the podcast? You've got a book out now, you do this journalism on the side. Like, how does it all fit together for you? And where are you hoping to grow or take it?
I mean, it was so satisfying to get to do such an in-depth project. You know, writing articles, it's just the turnaround so fast, and you don't get to do any real depth sometimes. So I'd love to write another book. I hope I get to write another book. I'm working on a proposal now, but you know, we'll see what the market decides. I definitely am really finding podcasting to like, I don't know that I'd want to have my own podcast, because having to like take that sort of financial risk, as well as just like having to do everything yourself, put together a team yourself, if that's part of it. Like, I'm really enjoying like doing podcast episodes for podcasts that already exist. But yeah, like, I mean, I you know, at the beginning, before we officially started and everybody's saying what they do, and it's like, oh, I'm a translator and an editor and a writer. It's like, I think for most people who freelance, it's trying to figure out the balance of things that works. Or, you know, if you have creative work that you do, it's like, do you figure out how to make the creative thing make money, or do you do something else to make money so you get to do the creative thing and keep it kind of pure? But, you know, for me so far, it's worked to just kind of stay nimble and try different things. I mean, before I was working on the book, I was doing food styling, which was really sort of paying the bills. And then I could write about things that were more interesting to me. And then I was doing food styling and writing at Food 52. And that was when, like, now this is like old news, this is come and gone, but like Facebook Live came along, and they're like, do you want to do Facebook Live? And so for like a couple of years, or a year, however long that lasted, I was just like doing Facebook Live from my kitchen. And that was one of the things I was doing. It's just like cooking on Facebook Live. And then that went away. And it's like, yeah, so now the podcasting is, you know, audio journalism is a new thing that I'm doing. But, you know, who knows what's going to be the next thing. Like, I mean, I feel like but there's a thread between all of these, which is like the way to tell stories, to share culture. You know, it's yeah, I mean, I think getting to tell stories in all these different mediums is, you know, there will be a way to do it and make it into work, and we'll see which format it takes going forward, or maybe it'll continue to be a lot of different ones.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's see here. I guess maybe at this point, I should just go ahead and kind of ask my one question, which is, it seems like, you know, even hearing about, you know, you're doing these Facebook Lives, you've been writing
I mean, I'm not doing that anymore. That doesn't even exist
I know,
anymore.
Right, it doesn't do it, but you were writing.
I mean, maybe it does, but
yeah, maybe some people are out there still doing it. Now it's Instagram, who knows? But you've kind of like made this entry into journalism, and it's been a number of years now. You had already been publishing before you started going, obviously, because you were hoping to make it into a book. But I know that before that, you went to art school, you've done more visual art stuff. At what point did you kind of decide that you wanted to shift into journalism, or is that always something that you kind of wanted to do?
I mean, I didn't really decide. It just kind of happened. And yeah, I was always writing. I always liked writing, but and in art school, almost all the electives I took were writing classes. Anne Hood, the novelist Anne Hood, was the writing teacher that she had. I mean, there were other writing teachers, but I took all her classes because she had one on food writing, she had one on memoir, and one on travel writing. Then I was like a bike racer, pretty serious bike racer for a while after college. And I wrote a couple articles for like cycling magazines. And then food was always an interest too. And it was also my day job, working in restaurants as a baker and then a bartender, a cook. And I remember, so Sam Sifton, he's not the food editor of the New York Times anymore. Now he's like sort of the more high up, working on the whole sort of culture section. I'm not sure exactly what his title is now, but at the time he was the food editor of the New York Times. Like, I was working in a wine shop in my neighborhood as my day job, and he was a customer, and I worked up the courage to like ask him for some advice, and we became friends. And at one point I like went into his office in the New York Times to like have coffee and like ask him for advice for a little mentoring session. And I was like, I don't know, like, should I pursue food styling? Should I do writing, like food writing? Like, what's it going to be? He's like, well, why don't you just keep doing both? Like, maybe at some point one or the other is going to take off. But I just remember that moment because it was such good advice, and it was totally true. Like, as I said, for a while, the food styling was what supported the writing. And then now the balance has shifted where I'm mostly writing. So yeah, okay, that's my answer.
So, do you think you'll still keep doing food styling as you go forward, or are you?
I don't really want to do the kind of stuff I was doing for like advertising and stuff, because it's so much just like executing somebody else's creative vision. But as far as things that you can like get paid to do, it is pretty like fun and interesting. I mean, super high pressure and really exhausting, but because you're like bringing everything to a photo studio and like making all these things in a day and getting all the timing just right, and then breaking it all down at the end of the day. So I used to really like that sort of intensity and pressure and think it was exciting. And now I'm just like, I just want to work on like my stuff that I'm interested in. Like, I have my own ideas. I mean, food styling can be really creative and expressive too, but I don't know. I'm not sure if that's like the medium that I want to do that, that I want to use for telling stories at this moment.
Right. Okay. And then I guess just because I get to have one more in here before we go all up. One thing
I keep thinking like, oh, this is like the grand finale question.
No, it's not even. It's a small question. But so with your articles, like one of the ones that I saw for New York Times Tea Magazine was with brushes in Nara Fude.
Oh yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting because you go and you have a similar approach to what you do in your book, where you go and you give a profile of this artisan, and then you go into details about the techniques, how do they do it, what are the materials, and that part is of course very interesting. And then you zoom out and you go, what is the history of this? And then at the end of the article, it kind of goes into this entirely different direction, where you go and there's actually a kind of purchasable section introduced, where there's the makeup brushes that of course use these same techniques, or kind of off the same lineage, and people can purchase them or whatever. But it's a really involved article, and I was wondering, like, how does that even come about? Was that something where you go and you like?
That was an assignment. So I had pitched a whole bunch of things to Tea Magazine, and they like never answered me, even though like I had friends that had introduced me or whatever. And I was like, those jerks, like, if they ask me, I don't even want to write for them. And then they asked me, and I was like, oh, I'd love to. So, but yeah, it was an assignment, and so they wanted something for the beauty issue about brushes, and they'd heard about Narafude, and yeah, it worked out to my advantage to be a New York writer in Japan during the pandemic because they couldn't send people. That was so the beauty brushes sort of had to be part of it so it could fit into their beauty issue. And the editor kind of helped with that because like I'm not a beauty expert. I don't really follow makeup trends. I mean, I use makeup every once in a while, but I'm not like I don't, yeah, that's not my beat. But everything else about it like totally fit into the kind of thing I do. Like, here's this interesting person doing this interesting craft, and like let me like tell their personal story that's fascinating and give you like the context of the history of this craft and like why it's important and significant. Yeah, and that was great. Like I'm terrible at pitching, really. Like so much of writing articles as a freelancer is pitching, but like I'm just not very good at it. I probably shouldn't say that. I should encourage myself to like, no, I can do it. But like I just do much better once I have a relationship with an editor, because like I can write, but like I'm, you know, convincing somebody with a cold pitch that like my idea is just what they need right now is kind of hard. So it's like it's much better once I have a relationship with a editor or publication. So then that has led now to other things with Tea, something in the fall and something that I'm going to work on later this year. So that was great.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you and hear a little more about how you managed to do all that you've done and how
you're
you
a great moderator. You ask really good questions and move things along nicely. So yeah, thank you everybody for good questions and for listening to me talk about my work. Really curious about everybody else's work here too, the folks that I don't know.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.